On October 9, 2013, a seemingly ordinary afternoon in a quiet New Hampshire town would become etched into the memories of all who lived there. Abigail Abby Hernandez, a 14-year-old girl full of life, love, and promise, vanished without a trace. Abby was no stranger to the small community of Conway, where she had grown up surrounded by family, friends, and the comfort of familiarity. She was just days away from turning 15, and everyone who knew her described her as bubbly, kind-hearted, and always ready to lend a helping hand. But that Wednesday afternoon, Abby's bright future, one filled with plans, laughter, and dreams, came to an abrupt and terrifying halt. It was the end of the school day, and Abby had said goodbye to her friends, ready to head home like she did every other day. But as the minutes ticked by and Abby didn't come through the front door, her mother, Xenia, grew anxious. At first, it was a small worry. Maybe Abby had stayed late to chat with a friend, or perhaps she had stopped at the store on the way home. But as the hours dragged on, that small worry deepened into something far darker. Xenia picked up the phone, sent another text, and then another. No reply, no messages, nothing. The unanswered texts, the silence, and the fear that began to creep into Xenia's chest were impossible to ignore. Minutes stretched into hours, and Xenia's heart began to race. She was no longer just worried. She was terrified. Something wasn't right. The clock ticked on, but Abby wasn't coming home. Was she hurt? Had she gotten into some kind of trouble? Or was she somewhere close, but unable to reach out? The questions flooded Xenia's mind faster than she could process them. Every scenario played out, each one darker than the last. As time slipped away, the sense of panic grew. Xenia called Abby's friends. She called the school. She even called the police, trying to make sense of the impossible. But nothing made sense. Abby had simply disappeared. No clues, no witnesses, nothing to explain what had happened. With each passing hour, Xenia's dread only deepened. What had started as a simple concern now felt like a nightmare. A nightmare that only deepened as night fell, and Abby remained unaccounted for. It was the kind of disappearance that no one could fathom, especially for someone as beloved and familiar as Abby. How could someone so young, so full of life, just vanish without a trace? What kind of force could snatch a child away in the blink of an eye? To understand the horrors Abby would face in the days, weeks, and months ahead, we need to go back to the days before October 9th, 2013. We need to look at the girl she was, at the life she lived. Abby Hernandez wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a girl with a heart full of curiosity, a smile that could light up even the darkest room, and an unshakable strength that would one day keep her alive. Abby was the youngest of two children in a close-knit family. Raised by her dedicated mother, Xenia, their bond was strong, a product of love and resilience. Xenia worked tirelessly to give her children what they needed: shelter, food, and love. But it was never easy. Financial struggles, life's hurdles, they were a constant presence. Yet through it all, Xenia always made sure Abby felt secure. Abby's world, though imperfect, was filled with warmth, comfort, and a sense of safety. There was always a place for her to call home, always someone who would listen. Abby was always the type of girl who made an impression. Quick-witted, funny, and endlessly kind, she was beloved by everyone who knew her. She had a natural ability to light up a room. Whether it was in the classroom or at home, Abby was the glue that held things together. Despite the challenges she faced growing up, Abby found joy in the simple things. Reading was one of her greatest escapes. Books offered her an outlet for her dreams, her wild imagination. Hiking through the woods behind her home, Abby would often get lost in thought, dreaming of places far beyond the small town she lived in. She was a young girl who knew her own mind, full of ambition and hope for the future. Like many teenagers, Abby's life was filled with moments of self-doubt and uncertainty. She was the youngest, often feeling like she had something to prove, especially when it came to school. Though she excelled in her studies, there were moments when she questioned whether she was good enough, capable enough. But this didn't stop Abby from pushing forward. Her passion for learning and helping others fueled her, and with each new accomplishment, her confidence grew. As her 15th birthday approached, Abby had so much to look forward to. A new chapter of her life was just around the corner. She was planning to volunteer at the local animal shelter and maybe even get her first job. She was ready to take on the world. Abby got in. She made the choice to accept the ride, hoping the discomfort would end with a few miles of relief. The man was calm, friendly even. He reassured her, made her feel at ease for a brief moment. But what Abby didn't know, couldn't have known, was that her decision to climb into that truck was the beginning of an unimaginable nightmare. What followed next was nothing short of a nightmare. Abby was about to learn just how quickly a seemingly innocent choice could spiral into something terrifying. She had no way of knowing that the man behind the wheel was not a kind stranger, but a predator. In a matter of moments, Abby's world would change forever. How would you have reacted in Abby's place? Would you have accepted the ride, or would you have trusted your instincts to keep walking? At what point do we start second-guessing the choices we make? Could Abby have known the danger she was walking into? Nathaniel Kibbe, or Nate as he was often called, was a man with a history shrouded in darkness. A history that began long before the day he crossed paths with Abby Hernandez. Born in 1980, Nate's life was shaped by violence, neglect, and a series of poor choices that seemed to follow him wherever he went. As a child, he was unruly, aggressive, and out of control. Raised by his mother, who struggled with her own devices, it didn't take long for him to attract the attention of his peers, and not for any good reason. He became known as a troublemaker, a kid who didn't follow the rules, who took pride in his ability to provoke, to hurt, and to intimidate. Nate's childhood was marked by instability. His mother, struggling to raise him alone, was unable to provide the guidance and structure a young boy needed. She fought her own battles with addiction and mental health issues, leaving Nate with little direction. The absence of a father figure only deepened the emotional void in his life. It wasn't long before Nate turned to the streets, where gangs, drugs, and violence became his surrogate family. He quickly grew accustomed to the rough lifestyle, finding solace in the chaos and destruction that surrounded him. By the time Nate reached his late teens, he was already entangled in criminal activity. From petty theft to assault, his actions escalated as his need for control and dominance grew. There was no real attempt to turn his life around. Instead, he reveled in the darkness, each arrest and conviction just another badge of honor for a man who had no interest in conforming to society's expectations. Nate's criminal record was long, spanning a wide range of offenses, from weapons charges to violent altercations. His fascination with firearms was particularly alarming. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a need, a deep-rooted obsession that marked him as a dangerous individual. By the time Nate was in his 30s, his life had spiraled into a chaotic mess of dead-end jobs, failed relationships, and a series of violent outbursts. Living in a rundown trailer park, he existed on the outskirts of society, barely scraping by. His days were filled with aimless wandering and shady business dealings, always one step away from total collapse. He had no real connections, no one to love him, and no one to pull him back from the brink. Nate had created a life that was as broken as his psyche. Yet, despite all this, there was a part of him, a dark, twisted part, that craved control, craved power. And on October 9th, 2013, he would finally take that power in a way that no one could have predicted. A single, fateful decision would set in motion a series of events that would alter the course of both his life and Abby's forever. What made Nate Kibbe into the man he became? What was it that pushed him over the edge, that drove him to seek control through violence? Perhaps it was the broken home he came from, the lack of emotional support, and the crushing weight of a lifetime of failures. Maybe it was his complete disillusionment with the world around him, the feeling of being abandoned by society, ignored by the world. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something darker, something deeply ingrained within him that made him seek power by taking the one thing he could control, another human life. What makes someone like Nate turn to a life of violence? Was it his upbringing that led him down this path, or was there something more sinister at play? It was a typical fall afternoon on October 9th, 2013, but for 14-year-old Abby Hernandez, the world as she knew it was about to change forever. As she made her way home, the pain in her feet from the new boots she had been wearing all day became unbearable. She was tired, her pace slowed with each step, and the distance to home felt like a never-ending stretch. With each limp, her discomfort grew, and it was in that vulnerable moment that fate would intervene. As Abby continued down the road, a vehicle pulled into view. It was a dark truck, its engine purring low, seemingly idle, almost waiting for her. The driver, a man with an unsettling calmness in his demeanor, looked out the window, watching her. His smile, friendly at first glance, seemed to hold something else, something Abby couldn't quite place. Nate's voice came through the open window, soft and reassuring. He introduced himself, claimed he was just offering a lift to the young girl on the side of the road. The words were innocuous, nothing that would raise immediate alarm. But Abby, having grown up being taught about stranger danger, hesitated. She had heard the warnings. She knew what her mother would say. But her legs were tired, and the thought of being able to sit for a moment seemed like an irresistible relief. At first, Abby told him no. She made her way down the road, each step more painful than the last. But then, something about Nate's persistence made her stop. He had kept pace with her in his truck, his vehicle moving slowly alongside her. His words were soothing, almost comforting. He wasn't dangerous, he insisted. His offer was kind. It was a simple decision in the moment. The pain in her feet had taken its toll. In that moment of weakness, Abby made the choice. She stepped into the truck. What Abby didn't know was that this seemingly innocent act of trust would lead her into the clutches of a man who was far from harmless. Nate had carefully manipulated her decision, his charming demeanor masking the darkness within. As the truck pulled away, Abby thought she was simply hitching a ride. But that ride was about to take her into a nightmare she couldn't even begin to fathom. Inside the truck, the conversation continued, and Nate played his role expertly. He continued to convince Abby that everything was fine, but even as his words tried to reassure her, the walls of Abby's reality began to close in. She was now alone with a man who had already crossed a line that would never allow him to turn back. As Abby stared out the window, lost in thought, she likely couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that eerie, inexplicable sensation that something wasn't right, but couldn't be put into words. There was no clear danger, no immediate threat, yet there was an undeniable sense of discomfort building. At what point do you think Abby realized she had made the wrong choice? What would you have done differently in her shoes, knowing what she knew at the time? Would you have trusted your gut, or would you have accepted the kindness of a stranger like Abby did? What followed in Abby's life over the next 9 months would push the limits of human endurance. Imagine waking up each day to the cold, silent emptiness of a windowless space, its walls closing in with every passing hour. Abby's world shrank to the confines of a shipping container, a dark, suffocating prison where the concept of time lost all meaning, a place where hope and despair blended together into an oppressive, unyielding atmosphere. She was in the darkest part of Nate's property, hidden away, far from the world that once held any promise. The only sounds she could hear were the echoes of her own breath and the creaking of the container's walls. In the first days, Abby had no real understanding of the nightmare that had overtaken her life. She was disoriented, bruised, and confused, barely able to comprehend the magnitude of her captivity. Nate's presence loomed like a shadow over her every move. He was both her captor and the source of her survival. But this twisted dynamic wasn't one of trust. It was one of manipulation, control, and a raw battle of wills. Abby quickly learned that every minute spent in resistance, every shred of defiance, was met with punishment. Nate wasn't just holding her physically. He was waging a psychological war. The isolation was one of the worst parts of it all, the suffocating loneliness that no amount of dreaming could escape. The silence of the container, broken only by Nate's occasional visits, became both a curse and a twisted form of comfort. At least it meant he was still there, still watching, still holding on to her. But Abby wasn't just surviving, she was adapting. Day after day she found ways to outsmart him, to calculate her movements, to wait for the slightest crack in his routine. She watched, she learned, and most of all, she hoped. That flicker of hope never truly left her, no matter how dark the days became. Every small action Abby took was calculated. She knew the importance of preserving her strength, of holding on to whatever pieces of her old life she could. As the days turned into weeks, she grew more attuned to Nate's habits. She learned when he would be at his most relaxed, when he would let his guard down. She learned to speak in ways that kept her alive. There were moments when she had to play the role of the obedient captive, to keep him satisfied, to keep him from unleashing his wrath. But those were just moments in a larger plan. She was waiting for the one opportunity that would allow her to break free. Despite the horrific nature of her captivity, Abby held on to something profound. She refused to let go of herself. In her mind, she was still Abby Hernandez, a girl from a small town with big dreams. Those dreams became her lifeline, her escape route. She would close her eyes and imagine her family, her friends, her home. She would hear the laughter of the people she loved, the warmth of the world outside, even if she couldn't touch it. Abby's mind was a world of its own, a world where she fought back, not with weapons or violence, but with the power of her mind. There were times, countless times, when Abby questioned whether she could hold on much longer, the cold, the hunger, the constant fear. But those questions didn't come with answers. They came with a resilience Abby had to learn. She found strength in places she didn't know existed. In the quiet, in the darkness, she found the strength to fight for her own survival. Each day she asked herself, what if today is the day? How long can someone hold on to hope in a situation like this? What would keep you going day after day when the world around you seems determined to break you? Could you find the strength to hold on to yourself, to refuse to be defined by the terror you faced? The strength to endure wasn't just about physical survival. It was about the will to never give up, to never let this nightmare define her. And while every moment of captivity tested that resolve, Abby's mind never ceased to dream, never ceased to plan for the day she could break free. It was in the darkest moments that the spark of hope shone brightest. For 9 months, Abby kept fighting, even when she didn't know how. Her story is a testament to the power of the human spirit and the resilience of someone who, even in the face of unimaginable darkness, refused to let the light go out. In a moment of complete isolation, when all seems lost, how do we keep our sense of self intact? What fuels the will to survive when the world is against us? Abby's captivity was marked by small, calculated decisions that could have either cost her her life or brought her closer to freedom. She had learned the hard way that survival wasn't just about enduring the physical conditions, it was about navigating the dangerous, fragile terrain of her relationship with Nate. To her, every moment of interaction with him felt like a gamble, a balancing act between submission and rebellion, silence and speaking out, survival and surrender. Yet despite the horrors, she remained resolute. With every passing day, Abby's understanding of Nate deepened. She began to recognize his psychological patterns, his routines, the way he interacted with her, and most importantly, his vulnerabilities. Days blurred into weeks, and Abby started to understand the power of patience. She learned when to speak, when to remain silent, when to draw his attention, and when to stay out of the spotlight. She carefully observed his behavior, tracking his moods and reactions, measuring every word she spoke, every gesture she made. She learned that Nate thrived on control, on making her feel small, insignificant, powerless. But Abby, clever and resourceful, used this knowledge against him. The first glimmer of hope came when one evening, after days of being watched closely, Abby was allowed to read. Nate had brought her a book, one of many he had provided over the months. She knew the drill. She wasn't allowed to ask for anything. She had to take whatever he gave her. But this book, unlike the others, was different. In the back, Abby noticed a scribbled name, Nate. It was his name, written with care, but in a place she wasn't meant to see. For a fleeting moment, Abby's heart raced. She now had a piece of his identity, a name. The significance wasn't lost on her. This wasn't just another object. It was a weapon, a clue. For the first time since her abduction, Abby felt something other than fear. She felt power. It was a subtle power, perhaps even an illusion, but it was the first sign of something that could tip the scales in her favor. With the knowledge of his name, Abby began to experiment. She started by addressing him directly. "Nathaniel," she would say, careful to let the name linger in the air. The first time she uttered it, her heart pounded in her chest, a cocktail of fear and hope rushing through her veins. But to her surprise, Nate didn't react violently. As she'd feared, he didn't become enraged or even raise his voice. Instead, he looked at her with a sort of bemused indifference, almost as if he didn't care. Abby recognized that this small, seemingly insignificant action had given her a sliver of hope. For the first time, she realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to manipulate the dynamics of this twisted relationship. Nate had given her a piece of his humanity, a crack in the armor of control he had so carefully constructed. By calling him by his full name, Abby had crossed a threshold, subtly asserting her agency in a way that he hadn't anticipated. She had made him see her, not just as a captive, not just as an object to control, but as a person. This moment, this subtle act of calling him by his name, wasn't just a tactic. It was a breakthrough. Abby knew that in order to escape, she had to build trust, not in the traditional sense, but in a way that allowed her to gather information, to observe weaknesses, to know her captor's mind. By building this trust, however dangerous it was, she was gathering the tools she would need to escape. In the weeks that followed, Abby's strategy evolved. She continued to build this delicate rapport with Nate, learning more about him, all while being careful not to show too much vulnerability. She played her role with the precision of an actor, hiding her true thoughts beneath a facade of compliance. But beneath the surface, she was constantly scheming, constantly waiting for the right moment. Every conversation, every gesture, every shift in the air, Abby took note of it. She knew that even the smallest detail could be the difference between freedom and a lifetime of captivity. There were moments when Nate grew more unpredictable, his moods shifting from calm to erratic. Abby noticed this too, and began to adjust accordingly. The trust she built wasn't a genuine connection, it was a manipulation of circumstances, a way of getting closer to the only thing that mattered now: freedom. As much as she could, she studied his weaknesses, tested his patience, and, most importantly, she began to create a plan. A plan that would rely on everything she had learned: Nate's habits, his desires, and the one thing she could use to her advantage: his underestimation of her. But even as she grew more confident, the danger remained. Each day she spent in Nate's presence, the more she risked discovery. The line between being his compliant captive and his defiant escapee was razor thin, and Abby knew that at any moment, everything could fall apart. Still, she pressed on. Each word she spoke to him, each moment of trust she carefully built, was another step toward her ultimate goal: escape. Was this the moment Abby realized she could survive? Could you have done the same, building trust with your captor despite knowing the dangers? How far would you go to survive when the odds seemed insurmountable? What risks would you take to gain control in a situation where everything was stacked against you? July 2014. It seemed like any other day in the long, oppressive heat of summer. Yet for Abby, this day would become the pivotal turning point in her nightmare, a moment that would rewrite the story of her captivity. For the past 9 months, she had lived in fear, trapped in a shipping container with no hope of release. But fate, it seems, had other plans. An unlikely sequence of events began to unfold that would lead to her escape. For hours, Abby walked, lost in the maze of unfamiliar streets and distant memories. She had no idea where she was headed, only that she had to move, had to get away. The fear that Nate might change his mind and chase her down was overwhelming, but Abby's desperation carried her forward. She stumbled, exhausted and dehydrated, but her will to survive was unwavering. And then, as if fate itself had intervened, Abby began to recognize the signs, the familiar landmarks, the old roads she had once known as a child, a house in the distance, a curve in the road, a tree that had always been in the neighborhood. It was her hometown. She had made it back. Her heart raced, and her steps quickened. She was no longer just walking, she was running, her legs carrying her faster than they had in months, fueled by the desperate hope that just beyond the horizon she would find safety. And there it was. Home! After nearly a year of torment and captivity, Abby had finally made it. The town she had known as a child, the streets she once walked with her friends, all of it came flooding back to her in a moment of overwhelming relief. But even as the distance between her and Nate grew, the terror of the past 9 months lingered in her mind. She was free, yes, but it was not the same kind of freedom she had imagined. The scars, both physical and psychological, would take time to heal. Could you ever fully trust someone after being held captive for so long, especially when they offer you freedom under such strange circumstances? How would you process that moment? Walking away from the person who held you, but still knowing they could come after you at any time. Could you have the courage to take that first step, unsure of what the future would hold, yet knowing it was your only chance at survival? Abby's return was a moment that defied belief. After nearly 9 months of unimaginable horror, she stood on the doorstep of her home, the same house where her family had once gathered for birthday parties, family dinners, and quiet nights. But this return was different. It was not the joyful reaction they had once imagined. It was the unexpected, fragile moment of a child returning from a nightmare no one could have prepared for. The Hernandez family, devastated by months of anguish, had almost given up hope. They had plastered posters, searched endlessly, and waited for any word, any sign that Abby was still alive. But nothing had prepared them for the moment when Abby appeared at their doorstep, standing there, exhausted but alive. In the courtrooms, where Nate would eventually face justice for his actions, Abby took a stand, not as a victim, but as a survivor. The strength it took for her to relive her ordeal and testify against her captor was immeasurable. But it was her statement in the courtroom that shocked everyone present. With a calmness that belied the horrors she had indulged, Abby forgave Nate for what he had done to her. She spoke of how his actions had taught her to cherish every breath, every moment of life. She said it wasn't easy, and it wasn't something she had expected to be able to do. But she forgave him because she realized that holding on to anger and hatred would only give him power over her for the rest of her life. By letting go, Abby was claiming her freedom in the most profound way possible. Forgiveness, for many, is an impossible thing, but for Abby, it was a path to healing. The emotional toll of what she had endured was far from over. No amount of therapy or support could simply erase the impact of those 9 months. There would be days when the trauma would resurface, when the memories would be too much to bear. But through her incredible courage, Abby found a way forward. As Abby walked this long road to recovery, she did so with the unwavering support of her family, but more than anything, she did it with an inner strength that had been forged in the darkest moments of her captivity. Every step forward was a victory, every moment of healing a triumph over the horror she had survived. What would it take for you to forgive someone who caused you so much pain? Could you ever find peace in a situation like Abby's? And what role does forgiveness play in true healing? Can someone truly heal after such a traumatic experience? Or is the road always one of constant recovery? Nate Kibbe's arrest marked the beginning of justice for Abby, but for Abby herself, it was never about seeking revenge. It was about reclaiming her life, moving beyond the trauma, and finding peace. The world watched as the courtroom proceedings revealed the horrors she had endured, but Abby's focus was not on what had been done to her, it was on what she could do for herself moving forward. With Nate sentenced and justice served, Abby didn't linger on anger or bitterness. Instead, she focused on the strength that had carried her through those dark 9 months. She became an advocate, using her voice to raise awareness for victims of abduction and abuse. Her story, though painful, was a story of survival, resilience, and, ultimately, of forgiveness. Abby's courage and grace were seen in the courtroom, and even more so when she stood before crowds at victims' rights events, sharing her journey of healing. Today, she is more than just a survivor, she is a powerful voice for change. Her story has touched the hearts of many, and it continues to inspire others to face their own challenges with resilience and hope. What we can take away from Abby's story is a powerful lesson. No matter the obstacles, we have the capacity to rise above them. Her journey is one of not just survival, but of triumph. Abby has shown us that even when life is at its darkest, there is always a way forward. And through her story, we are reminded that we too can find the strength to overcome life's hardest trials. What can we learn from Abby's story? How can we all find the strength to overcome life's darkest moments? How do we move forward after facing the unimaginable, just as Abby did? If Abby's story has moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with others who need to hear it. Her message of survival and strength deserves to be shared far and wide, inspiring those who are struggling to keep going. If you're someone who has faced challenges or trauma, remember, you are not alone. Reach out for support, share your story, and remember that there's always hope, even in the most difficult of times. If you want to learn more about survivor support organizations or get involved in helping others, check out the links in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.